Good afternoon. My name is Steve, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Midwest and High Plains Drought Update webinar. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. Thank you. Climate Service Manager for the Central Region, John Ives, you may begin your conference.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone to our monthly update of drought conditions across most of the central United States. Today, we're happy to have Dr. Dennis Toddy, state climatologist in South Dakota, and he's at South Dakota State University. So, Steve, take it away.
Steve or Dennis?
No, Dennis. Who is it? I don't know. No, Dennis, take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Okay.
Okay, Fred.
Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the central region. Hopefully you're enjoying your afternoon, either experiencing the next cold blast or waiting for it to come. Outside my window here in Brookings, we actually have some flurries going on as we see a little bit of light snow in parts of the plains. Get on to our monthly outlook update and impacts. I included climate and drought because we do still have some carryover drought issues, but we're still dealing with we also have some very wet areas in all parts of the region, which are going to be talked about also. So we'll get on with this here. Our picture on the front page is not so much a climate picture, but a weather picture. But I thought rather impressive, passed on to me by Jim Angel from Illinois, which is a picture of striations from one of the tornadoes last week from Washington, Illinois. So, it was a very impressive weather event, but also a rather impressive climate event. We're not going to dwell on this too much, but impressive from the scale of what we had in the way of tornadoes any time of year, but also impressive for this time of year to be having, I believe this is an EF4 tornado, having that occurring in the month of November. Jim did remind me, and I think this is also the case with several states in the middle to southern part of the central region, that tornadoes can occur any month of the year, but November is rather late in the season to be seeing much in the way of tornadoes, especially in the way of strong tornadoes. Also produced some heavier rainfalls, which produced some recovery in some of the drought issues they've had there. But Jim also noted it was because of the banded nature of the precipitation. They had some banded recovery in some areas that did not receive recovery. So let's go ahead and just a reminder of all the people that are involved in this: John Ice from National Weather Service, Doug Cluck from NOAA, other state climatologists, both regional climate centers, National Drought Mitigation Center, and USDA. Reminder, our next Drought Outlook webinar, the third Thursday of the month, is going to be December 19th with a presenter to be determined, but we will be having it next month as we head into the Christmas season at that point. Previous webinars are available either through the regional climate centers or at drought.gov. And a reminder that there will be time for questions at the end because of the way of the format. Interaction during the call is a little bit more difficult to do, so hold on to your questions and we'll have some discussion at the end. Quick review of the agenda, some kind of historical context on where we are right now over the last couple months, look at some of the records going on, some current conditions, some of the impacts, and outlooks for what we can say going on into the winter season at this point. Kind of a recap on what happened during the month of October. You see a pretty clear pattern across the country here with a trophy pattern over the western U.S. where we had mostly colder conditions, ranking in the top 25 coldest to a few places top 15 coldest Octobers on record, and then a ridge pattern with much warmer conditions over on the eastern seaboard. With fairly persistent cold and fairly persistent warmth throughout the month here. From a precipitation standpoint, a little bit different story. You can see where that trough pattern set up. and a good portion of the central part of the country where that trough was, we had wetter than average conditions. The whiter states kind of, a little wetter than average, but near the middle of the distribution, greener areas above normal, and then our northern plains areas coming in at much above normal, largely because of the blizzard event early in the month, but there were also some heavier, a couple other heavy precipitation events, liquid events that surrounded that added to it. You can see, again, out towards the coast with much drier conditions in those areas. So the focus, as we go on, we'll be looking at drought conditions. This presets kind of our pattern. We'll talk a little bit about that later on with some very wet conditions up here in the northern plains, a little recovery in some other areas, but some dryness ongoing in other areas. Speaking of the blizzard, and the big parts of precipitation occurred earlier in the month. So we're going to show some maps now that updates, since we are getting later in the month of November, we want to update where we are over the last 30 days. And what we can see in the way of total precipitation, the upper left-hand side, that in the latter part of October and through the first 3 weeks of November now, precipitation has greatly fallen off over the plains areas where we've had less than an inch of precipitation, some places less than half an inch or in that category. Not too unsurprising because as we get into November, our average precipitation does fall off for this time of the year. If you look over in the more Corn Belt areas, we've had some places with 5 to 6 inches of precipitation, with some spots of heavier precipitation. As we compare that to average, you can see that over most of the plains we're running slightly below average. Minnesota area running 1 to 2 inches below average, and some other pockets in the east below average. But much of the Corn Belt is in the category of up to 2 inches above average, with some areas 3, 4, and you can see northern Michigan and parts of the UP of Michigan being 4 to 5 inches above average, so getting some heavier precipitation in there. Looking at temperatures over that same last 30 days, average temperatures, you can see average temperatures are hanging around freezing in the northern tier of the states, in that 30 to 33 degree range. A little bit warmer as you've headed south, getting down into the 50s as you get in the southern part of the region. How that compares to average does give you another indication of what's happening in the way of the pattern. The yellow area, departure from normal, is slightly above average temperatures, mainly in the western states of the region, Wyoming, Colorado, and western Kansas and Nebraska, but largely below average temperatures throughout, from the Dakotas down to Kentucky, Ohio. And that gives you kind of an indication of what the pattern is like in the way of the jet stream. If you can imagine the jet stream coming down from the northwest, to the left of that jet would be the coldest area coming down from Canada and being kind of shuttled down into the main part of the Corn Belt. To the right of the jet, to the south of the jet, somewhat warmer temperatures. And that is the pattern that we have continued to see on a recurrent basis. And I think the pattern that is likely to be ongoing as we go on in the wintertime, consistent northwesterly flow, bringing colder air down from Canada, and not a ton in the way of precipitation. Some heavier precipitation in the eastern part of the Corn Belt where we've been able to tap into moisture. But over most of the plains areas, when you're dealing with northwesterly flow, there's just not that much moisture along with it during this time of year. Canadian air does not bring a lot of moisture along with it. We do, however, have a little bit of snow cover at this point. Again, third week of November. You can see the northern plains has, up to 2 inches in over most of the area with some light snow recently. Snow ongoing, probably into the Nebraska, Iowa, and southern South Dakota, Minnesota area. As we go into the weekend, we'll probably get a little bit of snow cover there, but not anything very heavy. You can see up into Montana, a little bit heavier snow cover north of Billings there. But really not a whole lot on the ground at this point. That's not too much different from average for this time of year. But we do have something we're working with. And you can see some heavier snowfall amounts, obviously, up in the mountain areas. We'll talk more about that here in a second. From a precipitation temperature standpoint, looking at records, the blizzard and associated other storm events broke a number of records for October precipitation and snowfall. Most of northwestern South Dakota was in the top 3 for monthly precipitation totals. If you go up into North Dakota, precipitation totals were not quite as large, so certainly top 10, some of the same things for Montana and Wyoming. But as we saw earlier on, the really pocket of the heavier precipitation was in that western Dakotas into Nebraska, Wyoming area. Just one station to throw in, being a little bit colloquial here, Lemon, South Dakota, 33.34 inches of precipitation so far this year. It has already beat its previous record by nearly 8 inches, giving an indication of how wet that area has been. Certainly around the North Dakota-South Dakota border, but larger context of that area, especially from the latter part of summer on. And that is presetting some conditions we'll talk about as we get along further in the call here. From the USGS, 7-day average stream flow kind of gives you an overall indication of what conditions are like and how variable they are throughout the central region. The brownish areas are below average or below normal stream flows for this time of year. The greens are near normal, so you see lots of near normals, a few pockets of below normal, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and parts of Minnesota. But surrounded by Wisconsin and Michigan and to Ohio, Indiana, we have some above median stream flows, and then those areas we've talked about as being very wet on the northern plains, much above average stream flows, and some in the highest on record. Part of that is not, it's not saying much because some of these are probably dry at this time of year or nearly dry at this time of year, but certainly indications of how much moisture is in the soil. We'll talk about that here in just a second. And then going up into Montana, parts of Wyoming, we get into some of the drier below median stream flows again. Okay. Since we've talked about soil moisture, again, from an overall standpoint, just a sidelight, a number of us were at a meeting last week where we were in initial stages of discussing a national soil moisture monitoring network of what it would look like, what components would go into it. And until that becomes enacted, this is one of the few things we have to work with is a modeled from NLDAS soil moisture anomaly. The anomaly here again is in meters, so you divide by 25 to get inches. Pretty clear demarcation line there between the Dakotas and northern plains and into the main part of the Corn Belt. You see from Montana and the Dakotas looking anywhere from 2 to 4, 5 inches above average for this time of year, indicating the very wet conditions in that area. You get on into the main part of the Corn Belt here, and you see quite the opposite, still carrying over 2 to 4 or 5 inches below average for this time of year. Now, again, this is a model. I guess let's include one more area from Kansas, southern Missouri, on over into Kentucky. There's some heavier precipitation has helped soil moisture recover in those areas. Again, this is a model, so it may not reflect completely in your area. One example of this, I didn't include the plots, but there are a couple field stations in Minnesota which do gravimetric sampling, actually going out, taking a soil sample and drying it. And despite the indications in the overall category that they are below average, well below average in the way of soil moisture, the samples from southern Minnesota indicated, one of them in southwest Minnesota near Lamberton was indicating near average soil moisture, and then Waseca, which is more south central Minnesota, was indicating between 1 inch and 2 inches below average. So what's reflected in the soils may not quite be what is being reflected here in the model. But certainly we have a case where much of the Corn Belt is probably behind on soil moisture recovery at this time of year. That has helped in the way of allowing good progress in the way of harvesting. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Whereas the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Most of the harvest had been done, but any other additional field work has been slowed because of wet soils in those areas. Post-blizzard, they had very difficult times moving cattle from certain areas because they were unable to get out into fields. Same kind of thing up in North Dakota. With trying to get out and do final field work in the fall has been slowed because of wet soil conditions. What that leaves us with on the U.S. Drought Monitor, we've kind of tried to piece the two regions together here. The areas in white, again, are no droughts. Yellow areas are D0, abnormally dry. So what we're seeing overall is parts of western Nebraska, western Kansas, and eastern Colorado, still ongoing dryness conditions with some widespread D2 kind of in the orangish category, D3 in the red, and still a pocket of D4 down in Colorado. And then some D1 to D2 conditions over Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, where we have some of those ongoing, we saw in the soil moisture deficits still ongoing. So we still have some of those occurring. We're at a point in the time of the year where there's not going to be very much opportunity for big changes, especially unless we get some major precipitation events. Soils are going to start freezing up, and they will not be reflecting or reacting too much to some of the existing moisture. Some of the plains, if we can get some precipitation, would be able to react to that still. If we put those on to some of the main crop growing areas, only a couple things we were being aware of this time of year is the winter wheat areas, the drought areas overlaying on winter wheat. You can see the biggest area of drought overlaying with winter wheat is in that western Nebraska down into Kansas, down into Oklahoma. We're still seeing some of those ongoing drought issues overlaying on top of the winter wheat areas. The main drought areas in the Midwest are not main winter wheat areas, so not too much of an issue in that location. Hay, pasture land areas, obviously the plains are a big area for those, and still some in the Midwest, so some carryover impacts in those areas also. I mentioned earlier soil temperatures. Soil temperatures are a harbinger of a number of different things. After 50 degrees, when temperatures fall below 50 degrees, before soil frees up, people who may do fall application of nitrogen can be doing that activity. That has been limited somewhat, again, because of soil moisture conditions. And then when soil does freeze up, that will help in some cases to be able to get out and do some additional field work where places have been too soft. So our soil temperatures, on the left-hand side, we have the Dakotas, where we're down to low 30s, probably right at freezing or just below freezing over much of North Dakota. Starting to get some of that into South Dakota. Most of the rest of the plains is still running above freezing at this time. Get over to the other part of the Corn Belt, the blue area here indicating upper 30s, somewhat lower 30s over in Minnesota, so not quite to freeze up, and then much of the other part of the Corn Belt not seeing too much, seeing temperatures well in the low 40s, so ample time for doing field work before we get to freeze up there. Overall agricultural issues, as we wrap up, we've largely reached the end of the harvest season here. Except for the Dakotas, really progressed without any major issues. We're close to being completed. Corn, 91% harvested nationally. Soybeans, 95%. Winter wheat is 89% emerged, so we're in pretty good shape there. You see sunflowers, only 65% harvested. A little slower on those. I think some soil moisture conditions have come into play. That was one of the crop issues with the blizzard, was getting lodging or knocking down of sunflowers. So it's going to be hard to be harvesting those, especially in western North Dakota. Generally, what we've been hearing is yields are near to above expectation. USDA will continue to report those out as we go along. But what I was hearing anecdotally seemed to indicate people were pleased with where they were or above what they were expecting. Only one other fire issue we heard. Typically, this is not a big fire time of year given the cooler temperatures, but there has been some concern expressed by Mary Knapp about potential for fire conditions, again, given the ongoing dryness down there, some cropland and pasture land that's still not in very good shape. but they could still have some fire issues even going into winter. Okay, one other issue when we're talking about the soil moisture conditions and the amount of precipitation that fell in the northern plains. The thing you have to remember about precipitation that is put on the soil in the fall, anything above saturated soils will drain off. Any of what we call field capacity has an opportunity to drain off or run off as we go through the fall. But if you have a soil that's at field capacity, basically holding a certain amount of moisture, most of that's not going to dry out as we go through the winter time. So wet soils tend to stay wet as we go along into the winter time. We have seen some surface drying over the western plains as we've had some warmer temperatures, but fall is typically not a good time to dry soils out. Temperatures just aren't warm enough to be able to create too much evaporative potential. So we're going to be carrying over some moist soils going on into the winter and spring. This led to a conversation among several partners in the Missouri Basin last Friday, kind of assessing the situation, where we were and what we're looking at going on into the winter. Kind of a mixed bag. Generally, yes, that area we showed as wet in the plains, Wyoming, and parts of Montana is going to stay wet through the winter time. So that bears watching. The amount of runoff from the precipitation in the fall has refilled a number of reservoirs in that same area, causing some to go into emergency spillways. So we don't have a lot of capacity there. On the Missouri River system as a whole, I again have interacted with the Corps for a number of years, but still don't quite understand the whole terminology. But basically, there is not too much concern from their standpoint because they do have still capacity, and I think the assessment was correct. They are somewhat lower than they would expect to be at this time of year. So they have capacity to handle heavier precipitation if it should occur. The overall assessment was that we're a little ahead of the game at this point in the year, but there's still much of the year and much can still happen. And that's kind of indicated here by the upper part of the Missouri Basin. The mountain snowpack water content from above Fort Peck and then from Fort Peck to Garrison. The red line is the overall average accumulation of inches of water equivalent throughout the water season starting in October and peaks in April, May time period. The blue line indicating that we are somewhat ahead of average for this time of year, but that we are still very early in the season. This is not a big precipitation time of year. As I mentioned, much more has to happen this winter time going into spring before we'll have a good assessment. But at least all the parties are aware of the situation and talking and watching for current conditions and outlooks. Okay, speaking of outlooks, we'll dive into those here, going on into what we know from the next 7 days out into the next 3 months and the seasonal drought outlook. First thing we'll look at, which is driving a lot of what we are going to say and can't say more so about the outlooks, is what's happening with El Nino or La Nina. Basically, these are the outlooks or the potential for La Nina in the blue, El Nino in the red, or neutral conditions in the green in 3-month periods going out to next summer. And you can see by far the most likely outcome in all these periods is neutral conditions, staying in neutral conditions. You can see as we go into the next spring or early summer, somewhat of a chance of getting back to El Nino, but the most likely outcome is still neutral conditions. Again, we're talking about sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. There are probable outcomes when you get into El Nino or La Nina that kind of stacks the deck on the outlooks one way or the other. It's not an end-all and be-all in the outlook, but it does give us a little hint of what direction we're going to go. Neutral conditions tends to be a little more wide open as to what could happen, but there still are a few things we can say about neutral conditions. So a lot of our outlooks are tempered by the fact that we don't have an El Nino or La Nina to guide us. So going in the next 7-day period, again, this is not necessarily El Nino, La Nina impacted. How much precipitation is expected over the next week? You can see throughout most of the northern plains, little chance for precipitation over the next week as this cold push of air pushes through the plains and Midwest, pushing the chances for precipitation further south. You can see just south of the Ohio River Valley has better chances of precipitation. The best chances for precipitation are in the south to the east coast, with only eastern parts of our area, maybe up to an inch over the next week at best assessments. Looking beyond that, in the 8 to 14-day outlook, now we move to our probability aspects. From a temperature standpoint, that cold push will continue into the eastern part of the U.S., so that the eastern U.S. will be, and the eastern part of the central region has a better chance of being below average temperatures for the end of November, first part of December. Most of the northern plains in near normal conditions, with a little chance for above average further west and up over the northern Great Lakes. From a precipitation standpoint, a good portion of the central region stays on the likely dry side. Again, with that colder air coming down, lesser chances for precipitation. A little bit above average chance for precipitation along the northern tier of states, along the coast, or along the border with Canada. As we look now through the month of December, there's been a kind of a carryover from last month in precipitation and a little bit of a change in the way of temperature. So let's go to precipitation. If you've been watching these outlooks, NOAA has been kind of sticking with an area of above average chances for precipitation in the Montana-Wyoming area, and they're sticking with that in December. Some of the dynamic computer models are sticking by this, and there's a little bit of a hint of that possibly happening during ENSO neutral conditions, which is what we are right now. A little bit of drier than average, possibly across the southern part of the basin, nearly EC across most of the area, and that's not unexpected this time of year. The average precipitation over much of the central region during December is relatively small, so you can be largely influenced by one major event. There was a bit of a change on the temperature side. As we look on the left-hand side here, you'll see an introduction of blue with better chances for below average temperatures right along the coast or along the border with Canada there. Warmer than average area further in the southwest, largely outside the central region. But watch that area as we go on in the 3-month outlook. December through February, you see that colder than average potential being enlarged, and that will carry on throughout the winter time here. Largely from the standpoint of, we talked earlier about the jets being kind of in a northwest flow pattern, bringing more cold air down out of Canada. The models seem to be sticking with that kind of a recurrent pattern where we continue to get colder air intrusions out of Canada without too big a change. Down in the southern part of the U.S., again, out of the central region, better than average chances to stay above average in the way of temperature. And that precipitation area over Montana and Wyoming sticks with us. Again, not a strong one, but worth keeping an eye on, especially given some of the precipitation over that area. We'll have to watch, because when we have preset our conditions with wetter soils, if we were to be above average in the way of snowfall in the winter and wet in the spring, we could produce some locally flood areas based on the basin and the conditions. Again, no major concerns right now in the Missouri Basin as a whole, but we'll continue to watch it as we go along. From a drought standpoint, we don't have, again, a large amount of drought left over in the central region, but the seasonal drought outlook just released. This goes through February. The brown area is indicating most likely persistence of drought, again, because as soils freeze up and the overall amounts of precipitation we expect this time of year are not large, and that we don't have any indications of above average precipitation. Most likely persistence, indicating over in Missouri and Illinois a little chance for redevelopment in that small pocket area, and that little green area in Wyoming that sits under the above average chances for precipitation, where there could be a little bit of recovery in that location. So not too much change as we expect over the 3-month period. At the end of the month, the monthly drought outlook will be, that is a new product that is available now, will be updated for the month of December. So to kind of summarize, recent conditions, impacts, recent heavy precipitation, has wet the areas of the plains, need to be watched for what happens this winter and spring, for the impact on flooding. Also would slow down any field work in that area. And also wet conditions tend to produce bad calving situations for cattle in those areas. And with feeding they took through the blizzard, they want to keep calving loss to a minimum, especially going on into this next year. Harvest season wrapping up largely, few major delays or major problems, save for some in the Dakotas where we've had some wet conditions. The freeze up of soils in those areas will be beneficial for wrapping up some of the areas that are a little bit too wet. We tend to talk a little about fire potential further south in Kansas where the drought conditions are continuing. Really kind of a mixed bag in the way of stream flow, some lower in certain places, certainly higher where we've had some of the heavier precipitation events. Soil moisture recovery is on the borderline of excessive in parts of the plains, but has been somewhat limited in the main part of the Corn Belt and some ongoing drought in those areas also. From an outlook going on, ENSO neutral conditions are expected to continue, so we can't use El Nino and La Nina to help us. In the northern plains, likely cooler than average is expected. Some potential for wetter in Wyoming and Montana. How wet is yet to be determined. We'll have to keep an eye on that. The probabilities are not terribly high on that, but it does bear watching. Drought conditions likely limited changes because of average precipitation during the wintertime, and then we have to watch winter and spring precipitation for spring flood potential, and again how quickly people will be able to get out in the fields in the spring. With the drier soil moisture conditions across main part of the Corn Belt, we'll have to see what winter precipitation lines up like. If we're still somewhat dry going into the spring, that will probably allow quicker field work in the spring, but a large part of the Corn Belt often does not freeze up quite as much as the plains and northern Corn Belt areas do, so they can get some soil moisture recovery through the winter. Okay, just a reminder of all of our partners in this with the Regional Climate Centers, NOAA, National Weather Service, NDMC, NIDIS, and all of the partners helping to provide climate services for the region. And these are some of the important people, not all of the important people involved in this. So thank you, and I will take any questions or further discussion you want to have right now.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star and the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile a Q&A roster. Your first question comes from the line of Bryce Anderson. Your line is open.
Yes, good afternoon, Dennis. Good to hear you again. And I was wondering if, just for the sake of conversation, if the conditions that you're looking at right at this point in the fall have any comparison to any fairly recent seasons in other years that come to mind. Any thoughts on that, please?
Hi, Bryce. Looking for analog years. I guess I can't. I didn't. There was not an analog year that struck to mind. Certainly, the wet fall has been has reminded of a pattern we're seeing in the northern plains, where we've seen an overall trend towards wetter falls. The last 2 falls we've taken a little sojourn from that, but the trend has been towards wetter fall, and then puts us in a situation in the spring where we have tougher conditions getting in. From an analog years, no, I don't have any analog year thoughts. Any of the climate services folks, if you have an analog year that you think this compares to, I would happily take that, or if you want to chime up or send me a note, I'll put that on. I don't know, Bryce, if it's crossed any of your thoughts on a similar year?
Not just right off the top of my head. I was also wondering when that little above average amount of snowpack moisture was noted about halfway through the PowerPoint. I was wondering if that does lead to a little bit of possible nervousness about the whole flood situation, considering that, you know, we had the Upper Missouri flood outbreak here a couple of years ago.
And you know, certainly that was part of the reason we had this conversation last week, to assess the overall basin situation. And I guess if there's anybody from the Corps that would want to chime in to fill in the gaps in what I left here, my overall sense from our conversation last week is that there are probably certain basins, not the Missouri as a whole, but certain basins that we will have to watch very closely that could be more susceptible to flooding. The Missouri itself, I don't think there's, you know, what we had 2 years ago was the confluence of about 4 major things. And right now we don't even have one of those. So we'd have to have several other major things happen for things to line up just right. I know from the South Dakota situation, comparing where we were going in, you know, 2010, 2011 to now, we do not have the standing water that we had at that time. You know, our soils are pretty moist, but at that point we had any kind of sloughs, bottomland, whatever, had water sitting in it, and we don't have nearly that amount. So from our standpoint, we have quite a bit more capacity available to handle any kind of inflows into the river.
If I could ask one more question, that is, are you pretty confident that there's going to be a good soil moisture supply for corn planting next spring, even though there's those dry areas in Iowa and Illinois and so forth right now?
Good question. You know, I think we will be okay starting the year. You know, it could be, you know, depending on what happens, we could be conveniently dry to allow people to get out into fields and then allow precipitation recovery to occur after that. The thing we will at least have to watch, if we do get this recurrent cold outbreak without any kind of snow cover, we could get freeze up well through, you know, through a decent amount of the Corn Belt. If that happens, our ability to get soil moisture recovery will slow down quite a bit. If we don't get quite as cold as soil temperatures, you know, the central and eastern part of the Corn Belt certainly does have the opportunity to recover and pick up soil moisture throughout the wintertime, unlike the northern areas.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you. Your next question comes from the line of Paul Episto. Your line is open.
Thank you. Dennis or anybody else on the call can chime in on this if they have additional information. You mentioned the National Soil Moisture Network, and you and I have talked offline about this, but I'd be curious to get reaction from people on the call. What is needed? What's missing for, in this day and age, for that not to be in place? To me, is a little crazy. What's missing? Why isn't that already in place? What's the missing link?
Boy, it sounds like you're talking about biology and evolution there when you're talking about the missing link. The situation is well, probably the simple thing that's missing is money. There's not been a national push behind this previously. There's been lots of discussions. There is national interest in doing this now, but the glue that really needs to bring this together is some dollars to make it happen. This is being done on an individual basis, where we have probably, you know, 6, 8, 10 states that are doing some or part of this in their individual states to some level. Some, you know, like Oklahoma, are doing it in great detail. Nebraska is doing a very good job with it. Other states are, you know, have a decent number. We've tried a little bit in South Dakota. So you've got some pieces there. Adding this to existing automated stations would not take an inordinate amount of money, but it will take money and then maintenance for this to occur. You know, NOAA and USDA have listed this with a signed MOU from the end of last year, the beginning of this year. Secretary Vilsack is very much behind this, but as we know, things in D.C. right now, there's not new dollars available, or or very small new dollars available. So, I mean, this could happen without a huge amount of dollars, but we need some kind of core dollars to glue this together and make it happen. You know, the states that do have this, they're going to continue to do it, I would expect. But, you know, as was brought up, you know, some states are going, well, we're going to do this for ourselves, but what's our impetus to share? So we need to have some ability or some reason and some sharing to go along with this. So the initial steps out of this was there was a report that needed to be written coming out of this, but then also discussions about who are our partners and who can help try to make this happen and try to push this along. And that'll probably be the next step, reaching out to other partners in how we start trying to fill this out and getting the cooperation going among different states and different entities to make this happen.
Okay, your next question comes from the line of Diane Mankliger. Your line is open.
Hi, Dennis. This is Diane. Hey, I just had a question, and I know that it wasn't your graph, but I was wondering if we were to think about putting the Missouri River levels from 2011 on that map of showing where we are. I mean, I know we're not in the same conditions that we were in, you know, as far as, like you stated earlier, the surface waters and all that, but I guess starting out knowing that we got a few of the watersheds that are already with saturated soils or close to saturated soils going into this winter is kind of concerning.
And I mean, that is, you know, you heard the conversation last week. That's why we were having this, is, you know, making sure we shared what everybody knew, you know, not to spread it widely yet, just making sure that all the partners were aware of, you know, what we know, what we can say at this point. And we all agreed that there was still a long way to go and a lot of things to be determined. I wish Kevin Grody or someone from the Corps were here to talk about the Missouri River levels, because my take from it was that they were not even at the levels where they would like them to average on average for this time of year. So there was not as big a concern because there was even more capacity that they had to work with before they even reached into the flood capacity. I don't know. I don't get the terminology, and even though I've heard him talk about this a number of times, I still don't quite follow it. But it'd be nice if someone from the Corps could kind of mention that. And we can also, I'd be happy to share those too from our conversation last Friday to kind of show where they are.
Yeah. I mean, it is just one of those. It's like looking into, you know, we had some record snowfall. Now we got soil moistures that are kind of high. And for me, I'm thinking about the reservation areas where I know they pointed out some of the watersheds that could be flooding again.
Right. And that's, I think you hit it right on. There are certain watersheds we really need to watch because they are at higher risk than certain other areas are.
That was it. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you. And your last question comes from the line of someone whose information we were unable to verify. Actually, he just withdrew his question. There are no further questions at this time. I would turn the call back over to the presenters.
Okay. Since we don't have any other questions, I guess one more thing that we will obviously have the next webinar next month. For those in the Missouri Basin who there is obviously some concern about, especially given what happened 2 years ago, there will probably be another webinar or two as we get further along in the winter to update on conditions and to assess, you know, where our potential flood problems are, and you know, give an update on what's happened with moisture and what's happened with additional snowfall as we get further in the season. So do keep an eye open, and we'll try to let people know about those because, you know, obviously what happened 2 years ago was a major issue for those impacted and is very concerning. Again, we're not expecting any kind of repeat of that, but there are potential issues that we could see this spring. So try to get people a heads up coming on those. So thanks for your attendance today. I'll turn it back over to John.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you everyone for joining us. I would just like to ask one last time if there's any questions.
We did have that same person queue up for a question here, Mr. Eyes. So
Oh, okay.
Open their line.
Yeah, go ahead.
And please state your first and last name if he's queued up for a question. Your line is open.
This is Bill Dunn with Core in Omaha.
Hey, Bill.
Are we connected?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we were just going to comment about the Core's perspective. Dennis told, a great story there. Is, things are kind of lined up, so it might be a wet year. We're just basically looking at everything very closely and have a firm eye on everything. Our storages compared to 2011 at this point were maybe 3 or 4 million acre-feet lower than we were then, so that helps us as well, in case there is something that actually happens. But, again, at this point of the year, it's pretty early. Yeah, we are watching everything pretty closely. Over.
And we're anticipating our storage being probably about 4 to 5 million acre-feet below our target level on March 1st. So we'll have the normal amount of flood control storage plus an additional amount in the conservation pool going into next year.
Very good. Thank you, guys. And I guess, for those that are thinking back to 2011, we have to remember that there were several things that preset for 2011. We had a couple very wet years throughout the basin before that. We had a wet fall leading up to it. So soil moisture and then all surface water bodies were quite full. The Missouri River, the river system, there was not as much capacity available in the system. And then we had a very heavy plain snowpack and a very late and heavy accumulating mountain snowpack, along with a monster rainfall event in Montana. So there are several things that were historic that all lined up to that. So there's many more historic things would have to happen to put us back in that situation. But there was obviously impact and there's concern. So we're trying to make sure we're updating people on a regular basis, saying here's what the status is, here's what our potential is, and noting people we are continuing to watch this, so that we're not going to try to let anybody be caught by surprise on anything happening. Thank you guys very much.
Okay, and we did have another question queue up from the line of Benjamin Diamond. Your line is open.
Hi. I had a question about the soil moisture recovery in the Midwest. Why is that excessive? Could you elaborate more on that?
The soil moisture recovery in the Midwest was not excessive. Our soil moisture recovery in the Northern Plains was somewhat excessive. We're talking about the Dakotas, parts of Wyoming and Montana. As you get over, we can go back. I don't know if I can get back quickly. I've lost my slideshow here. If we can go back and look at where we were in the way of soil moisture, right here, this is what our soil moisture situation was looking like. So the area of the Northern Plains, Montana, and Wyoming is wetter than average, but soil moisture recovery in the Midwest has not been excessive. It's been, anecdotally, it's been okay. We've seen decent recharge to near average, or we've not seen recharge. So no, the Midwest was not excessive.
Thank you.
The only little variant on that was this area I noted from Kansas to southern Missouri to Kentucky, where we had some heavier late season precipitation, where soil moisture has been a bit higher than other areas.
Thank you. Your next question comes from, again, the line of Diane Manklager. Your line is open.
Hey, Dennis. Yeah, the one thing I was going to kind of note that has changed in recent years is, especially in the James River Valley and some parts of South Dakota, is an increase in the amount of drain tiles and so forth.
Yeah, and for those of you not familiar with this, what she's talking about is installation of drain tile in fields to increase the ability for water to get from fields into some sort of a drainage system and drain off. This has been very common throughout the main part of the Midwest for up to 100 years, it's only become, in the last 5 or 6 years, it's become very common throughout parts of the eastern Dakotas. And there's some trade-offs there, Diane, that I could have you talk to. There's another faculty member who's become heavily involved in education about drainage. That the pluses and minuses of it are that, yeah, it does speed water getting out of the field faster. But in situations like this where you are wetter in the fall, you allow some of that excess water to drain during a time of year, this late fall and winter, where we typically don't have as much runoff during those times. It does allow for some of that water to drain off now, so that it's not in the field come springtime. Now, the James River system, as we know, is a flat and very slow-moving system, so it's a very complex and problematic issue no matter what. And the James River was one of those that we noted with some higher potential for flooding in the spring because it being wet and just because of how slowly it drains. But there is a fair amount of work going on in the way of assessing drainage and impacts of drainage in our area too.
Yeah, I just noted that we have standing water where we usually don't in some of the creeks.
Yes, we do. And I'm not disagreeing with you there. That's why we're watching this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you. Again, if you would like to ask a question, that is star and the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Your next question comes from the line of Rick Kellish. Your line is open.
This is Rick Kelsch with the University of Nebraska Extension, and thank you folks for continuing to do these seminars. It's been very educational for someone like myself. We are seeing a group of our educators increasingly going to the maps that you've shared with us today and others, and picking and choosing those maps that have greatest value for the particular audience that they're dealing with. And let's say it might be an irrigator audience or a cow-calf producer that they deal with, and picking those maps that both outlooks or current conditions that are most valuable to them. Have you seen individuals that are doing what you say are doing well at that for targeting kind of the tools you folks have created over the years to certain audiences? And have you seen anybody that is kind of automating that process, like web pages that are audience specific, that are bringing in those maps as they're created?
Interesting question. I guess I don't, taking what I think you're saying, I don't know of anybody who has done that overall, but I know people have gathered certain groups of maps for irrigators, for agriculture people, for water managers. I know some federal sites, some NOAA sites have done this. Some state climate offices do this, regional climate centers, where they won't maybe set a strict set of maps, but they'll have a number of links to various information that may be useful for them. If you have some that you'd like to see or would like to correspond with someone about combining some of those, we can hook you up with either folks at the Regional Climate Center down at UNL or myself or some of the NOAA folks, where we could try to point these to you and try to get them onto a page.
And we visit with these folks, at least at the Regional Climate Center and the Drought Mitigation Center, regularly, and we're looking at trying to construct an app that would do this, that would pull together a number of these maps that might be crop producer specific or beef producer specific. But also looking for others that might have done that in other regions, that from which we might learn from some of the lessons that they've gained.
And partially it depends on the group you're talking with too. There are a couple regional projects who have done, some USDA projects who have done this in some of their web pages. For crop producers, there's a group called U2U out of Purdue. I'm part of that group. Some folks at the Regional Climate Center are part of that one also, where we've tried to combine some of these tools and maps onto a page, along with some other new tools we're developing. From a cattle side, we've put together a couple ourselves, but I don't know if anybody has done that on a more comprehensive basis for cattle. From an irrigator standpoint, we are trying to put one together for South Dakota, where we put together a number of these. I'm just trying to get the impetus to make this happen. So if you have thoughts, let me know, and I can point you to some of these folks.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing this. And you might consider as 5 minutes of some of your future seminars examples like that you think would be worth sharing.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
There are no further questions at this time. Mr. Ice, Mr. Toddy, I turn the call back to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we'll see you next month. Take care of yourselves and have a very good and safe, happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
This concludes today's conference call.